Descartes' The Automatism of Animals, taken from a letter to Henry Moore around 1648. Descartes asserts, in a bit of hyperbole, that the greatest prejudice is believing animals think. So according to Descartes, why do we make this mistake? Well, our reasoning is that we look at animals and see that their bodies are similar to ours in shape and movements. So we infer that they are like us, essentially an argument by analogy. It also, according to him, comes from the belief that our mind is what causes the motions in us. So we infer, again by analogy, that animals have a mind similar to our own. So essentially, according to Descartes, we make this mistake because we're reasoning by analogy. So in attempting to address this, Descartes draws a distinction between two different principles of movements in terms of bodily movements. So what he's trying to do essentially is explain how animals move and claim this occurs without a soul. Well, without a incorporeal soul. Because he does talk about a corporeal soul, which is sort of confusing, because we generally think of the soul as being, by definition, non-corporeal. But be that as it may, the corporeal soul is this. According to Descartes, it causes movements that are entirely mechanical and corporeal, and depend, using his terminology, solely on the force of what he calls animal spirits and the configuration of the bodily parts. And by animal spirits, he doesn't mean like animal ghosts. He means, animal spirits. They're physical stuff. Again, kind of weird. So essentially what you have is bodily motions caused by bodily causes, and Descartes uses needlessly confusing terms like corporeal soul and animal spirits. Now the incorporeal soul, or mind, for Descartes, is a substance which thinks. Now, after considering this matter, he has demonstrated, or thinks he has demonstrated, that we cannot prove that animals have a soul that thinks, or so he claims. Now, the obvious counter to this would be, again, referring to kind of an argument by analogy and pointing out to animals that are particularly, seemingly intelligent. And so he does address this. He says, if you look at, say, the cunning tricks of dogs and foxes, and what animals do from fear, hunger, or sport, he says, yes, he doesn't deny that they do all this, that they have cunning tricks, etc., but he claims, essentially advancing an Occam's razor argument, a simplicity argument, that we can explain all this essentially by the workings of the mechanical, organic parts of the animals. So the gist of his argument is, it seems like they're, perhaps they're doing this stuff, but you can explain all this without bringing in the mind, or so he claims. Now, he is willing to say that even though he has demonstrated to his satisfaction that it cannot be proved that animals have thought, he's willing to allow that it cannot be demonstrated that the contrary is not true. So for him, demonstrated doesn't mean like doing like a demo, showing stuff off. It means establishing essentially with deductive proof. And so he is willing to concede that he can't, prove with certainty that they do not think. Why? Well, because, as he says, the human mind cannot penetrate into the heart to know what goes on there. So he considers, again, our reasons for animals thinking, reasons why we believe this. And essentially it's the argument by analogy once again. So he asserts the reason that's advanced to try to prove that animals think is that because they have organs of sense like ours, it's likely they have sensations as we do. And since thought is involved in our sensations, a similar faculty of thought must be attributed to them. Again, an argument by analogy. Arguments that we've seen before, that just being that animals are like us in these ways, we do the same stuff they do because we think, therefore animals think. And thinking involves a mind, so animals have minds. But he rejects this argument, and he says, since the argument is easy, the argument has influenced people. from infancy. But he believes that there are stronger arguments for the opposite, which are much less well known. So sort of his explanation is we think animals think because the argument by analogy is pretty easy, and we've been, making this argument, our entire lives. So one argument he advances here, not one of his main ones, but, kind of to illustrate his point, he asserts that it's more reasonable to make earthworms, flies, caterpillars, and other animals move as machines do than to endow them with immortal souls. And in kind of an Occam's razor. In the case of insects, it seems more reasonable, more intuitively plausible, and of course ontologically cheaper to say that they move mechanically as opposed to being driven around by souls. Or so he argues. So what does he consider his main arguments against animals having incorporeal minds? Well, he has three main arguments, one of which he considers his best argument, and we'll save the best argument for last, as he does. So his first argument against animals thinking is this. It's the bodies in motion argument. So animal bodies and human bodies contain bones, nerves, muscles, blood, and what he calls animal spirits. Again, that's not like, ghost wolves or something like that. It's something else in his metaphysics. And of course, other organs. And he points out correctly, these can produce themselves without aid of thought. You don't have to, think to, if you get a cut, you don't have to remind yourself and think consciously to heal that. And so essentially we have all this involuntary, growth. We don't have to think about it. He also notes convulsive movements of animals, that the body often moves with more violence and variety than with the aid of the will. That, to use kind of a sad example, like if an animal gets injured, say hit by a car, and it's flailing around terribly, it's not thinking to do that, that's just happening. Or, kind of a modern example would be like if you have like frog legs, and maybe you might have done this in like biolab, or like they're shocked and they twitch, and of course the frog is not willing to do that because it's got it's just legs now. It's no more frog. And so essentially his two main points are, one, we can have things that occur without any thought, growth, etc., of tissues, and there are convulsive movements that require no thought. So essentially he's establishing that stuff can happen, movements and growth, without thought behind them, to establish that possibility. And that's a fairly weak argument, because you might contend back, well, okay, stuff grows, and there are convulsion movements, but animals, they seem to do more than just clearly convulse and grow. So then he brings out his automata argument. And automata is essentially a rough way to put it in modern terms is, like a robot. And in Descartes' time, people were already constructing, automata that, they weren't obviously, electrically powered robots, etc., but they did have mechanical devices that would move automatically, and some very clever ones. Most of them, of course, were done for entertainment purposes, as opposed to being practical machines. But it was well within the technology to make things that would have clockwork mechanisms, and a clock would be a good basic example of this. And so when we build such constructs, we believe that they don't think. We don't think that our clock thinks, for example. And even our complex machines, we don't think that like a Roomba or a construction robot, or that they are thinking. And so he notes that if art imitates nature, nature might produce automata, and far more excellent ones, as animals are, than we make. Essentially what he's saying, roughly put, is that animals are God's robots, that these are produced in nature. And Descartes believed in God, so his view would be that God is creating these entities, and so they're essentially incredibly complicated, robots, organic robots that move without thought. And again, his reasoning essentially is kind of like an argument by analogy. We can build complicated machines, they do complicated tasks, but they don't think, they're purely mechanical. Therefore, nature, in Descartes' case God, could produce such constructs as well. And again, by Occam's razor, it would make sense to not have the soul in these in these animals, or one might contend. Of course, one might contend that if once you accept souls at all, if you're putting them in humans, they might as well be in everything. And so he concludes, so there is no reason why thought occurs in all cases where there is conformity of bodily members as with animals. So his reasoning is you can explain this again without there being thought behind it. And he says, it's more surprising for a soul to be in every human body than none in the animals. So, an interesting argument. The gist of it is you don't need souls to explain their movements, therefore they don't have souls. Conclusion. Now, not surprisingly, later thinkers applied the same argument to us, namely that you can explain everything that we do without there being a soul, and by the same line of reasoning, using Occam's razor, we would not have souls either. Now, Descartes doesn't make that argument. Descartes' view is that animals don't have souls, we do. So, what does he consider his best and most important argument here? Now, Descartes considers his third argument to be his best and most decisive argument. What he says is the principal argument that animals are devoid of reason. Now, it begins by noting that some animals in a species are more perfect than others, as among people. And he notes that this is most noticeable in horses and dogs, because some have more capacity to retain what is taught. And if you're familiar with dogs, you know that there are some dogs that seem really smart. They can know all kinds of words, they do all kinds of tricks and so forth, and they act extremely intelligent. And then of course there are dogs that are quite lovable, but don't seem to have any idea what's going on, and you have to keep a close eye on them so they don't eat rocks or something. And so he's right. Dogs and horses and stuff have rather different capabilities among themselves. Now, these animals, Descartes notes, are able to make us understand their natural movements of anger, of fear, of hunger, etc., by voice or other bodily motions. So he does recognize that dogs and other animals can express to us anger or fear or hunger. So a dog is barking savagely, can be angry, or perhaps also afraid. A dog that's hungry, it may make particular noises may have a particular trick that it does, like grabbing its their dinner bowl and slinging it around or something. And so they'll indicate to us these emotional states. So why doesn't he think they think? Well, the problem for Descartes is this. It is yet to be observed that any animal has such a degree of perfection as to use what he calls true language. What does he mean? Well, he says they've not indicated by voice or other signs, because it does allow that they might not have the capacity to actually speak as we do, but they could at least make particular signs, gestures, marks, etc. And he claims that not indicated by any means anything referring to thought alone, rather than what he calls movement of mere nature. So for him, the word, true language, is the sole sign and only certain mark of the presence of thought in the body. In the case of people, he claims that all people, even the stupid and foolish, to be a bit harsh, even those lacking organs of speech, use signs. And animals never do anything of this kind. So he takes this to be the true distinction between humans and animals. Essentially, a language test, roughly put. Something that talks using true language would have a mind, something that cannot would not. Now, Descartes, in other writings, he does know you could have a machine that would, if pressed in the right place or in completing certain tasks, would make a noise. And he said, that still wouldn't be true language. To use a simple example, think of like your car. When you open the door, the light the door open light, if you got one, comes on, but we wouldn't think that the car was intelligent. And you can, and of course there are toys that plays various sounds, and can make these noises at us. and have recorded words, but they don't talk. So for Descartes, essentially, it's got to be talking properly, a language test. Now, this is later developed by a fellow named Turing, which we'll talk about another point, into a language test designed to distinguish between humans and computers, a test essentially for artificial intelligence. Now, in terms of sort of assessing this test, one question, of course, is it actually revealing an incorporeal soul? Is it required that in order to be able to talk, you got to have a soul? And a person could counter by saying that being able to use true language would require capabilities, but would not prove a metaphysical soul. And of course, there are also those who claim that there are animals who do use true language. For example, there have been experiments with some of the apes where they give them iPads. Now, they used to use other stuff before iPads, but the claim is that they can construct meaningful sentences, like asking for yogurt or even telling jokes. And then, of course, critics say, well, they're not really using true language. They've just learned that if they do this, this, and that, then they get, like a treat, or they get a response they like. And then, of course, critics, people could also say, well, that's all we do. We don't really use true language in the sense we just respond to stimuli. So there's a lot of debate here about the language and how it works. So Descartes wraps it up by noting that he obviously does not deny what is clearly true, namely that animals live and feel. He speaks only of the thoughts of animals, and he doesn't deny that they have life. And he says life here, kind of a bad definition, is warmth of the heart. He also does not refuse or deny that they have feelings. So if you asked Descartes, before he was dead, do animals have like anger and perhaps even love, etc.? And he'd say they could, yeah, as far as it depends on bodily organs. So they would have physical, feelings. And they could have very, complex, feelings, but for Descartes, they'd all be mechanical. Now, again, later thinkers say the same thing about us, that we essentially, we feel stuff, but it's all just mechanical. There's no ghostly soul there. Now, he finishes by saying his opinion is not so cruel to animals as favorable to humans. And he, tying into a bit of ethics, he speaks to those not committed to the extravagant position of Pythagoras, who held people under a suspicion of crime who ate or killed animals. And our good dead friend Pythagoras, in addition to being the math guy and believing that numbers are real, he also believed in reincarnation, and you can be reincarnated as an animal. And so apparently he was a vegetarian because an animal could very well be a reincarnated person, or be reincarnated, I guess, later as a person. So if someone eats a hamburger, the soul of the cow that they killed or got the hamburger from could have been their grandma or grandfather, and that would be pretty bad. So Descartes thinks that animals don't have these incorporeal minds, and one moral implication of this, which affected science for quite some time, is that many scientists claimed they believed animals didn't have minds, so it was okay to treat them essentially as machines. And this was used either to try to justify or perhaps rationalize what we consider today to be mistreatment or abuse of animals. And so there were important ethical implications to this view. Now, kind of the more contemporary view is that people accept that animals do have not only just feelings, but also thoughts. And so Descartes' influence was pretty considerable, but the contemporary view is rejection in large part of Descartes' view. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.